Chairman Chung, Minister Yuan, President Kim, Richard, Ivor, distinguished guests, Your Excellencies. First of all, let me thank the NEAR Foundation for inviting me to this very important event. I read the survey report with great interest. It's an excellent report. And I only want to add one small qualification, and I agree with most of it. I just want to add one small qualification. I think it's a bit of an overstatement to call this a fragmenting world. I prefer to call this a return to normalcy. Competition, conflict, these are, to my mind, inherent characteristics of international relations. And it is a fundamental mistake, I think, to think of any international order as necessarily uncontested or even peaceful. For most of history, and certainly for the 40 years or so of the Cold War between the US and the former Soviet Union, it was the contest and the parameters of that contest that defined whatever order we had. And it was only a very short of an exceptional period of, say, 20 years or so, from 1989, let us say, when the Berlin Wall came down, to circa 2008, when the global financial crisis led to fairly widespread disillusionment, including among many Americans, with American-led globalization, that this fundamental reality of international relations, the inherent nature of competition and conflict, was masked by the overwhelming dominance of the United States. Well, that short period, that short and exceptional period, was extremely beneficial to all of us, right? But that does not make it any less exceptional or replicable. It's over. I think it's extremely dangerous to mistake the exceptional for the norm, as I'm afraid many in Europe have done and are paying the price right now. And I think it's futile to hanker over what cannot be replaced. I start with this point actually not as a message of gloom, but as a message of hope. Because all of us have navigated previous periods of competition and conflict, which in some ways were even worse than the present period, and not just navigated and survived, but prospered. All countries, even tiny countries like mine, and certainly middle powers like Korea, we have agency, no matter how dire the circumstances. Were it not so, I would not be standing here talking to you, because Singapore should not exist. I don't mean all that we are experiencing now, all that is contained in that very excellent survey report, fall into the historical norm of what the late Donald Rumsfeld called known unknowns. We've done it before, there's no a priori reason we can't do it again. This is not to say that nothing has changed. I think several things have changed in important ways. First of all, I think in the last 10 years, all of us have come to a much more balanced view of China. China is a geopolitical fact that cannot be ignored, but China is a country like any other. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, and it has some very serious structural weaknesses, both economic and political, that are now becoming evident. We'll still have to deal with China, that's not the point. And China is not about to collapse. But we'll deal with it, I think, in a more balanced way. Second, we are confronted with the fact of a different US. It's not just the prospect of Mr. Trump getting re-elected. I think after the end of the US-Soviet Union Cold War, the fact is that the US faces no existential threat anywhere in the world. And therefore, the US is going to be much more selective, transactional, if you like to use that word, in its international engagements. And therefore, the US is going to demand more of its allies, its friends, its partners, to help it uphold international order. I think we in Asia have recognized this much earlier. I think the Middle East is in the process of recognizing it in its own way. I think, again, the region or continent that has least recognized this or is resisting it is Europe. They are paying the price now for that rather period of sanguinity when they mistook the exceptional for the norm. But there is only one US, and we'll have to deal with it the best we can. And thirdly, I think while competition is inherent in international relations, competition among major powers in particular, I think the nature of that competition has changed, and we should understand that nature clinically. I do not like the phrase "a new Cold War" to describe US-China competition. I think it is a rather intellectually lazy phrase that misrepresents the nature of that competition in fundamental ways. The US and the Soviet Union led two entirely separate systems that were connected only peripherally. And in principle, if not always in practice, their competition was an existential one to see which system was the better way of organizing modern industrial society. We know the answer to that question. And more important, I think China reluctantly and partially also knows the answer to that system. China and the US are both vital parts of a single global system of immense complexity, the complexity provided by supply chains of a density of a complexity never before seen in world history. And I find it very difficult, as we have heard previous speakers say, to think that this extremely complex system is going to bifurcate completely into two separate systems. There will be partial bifurcation in specific sectors, but not. So they will compete robustly, but they will compete within a system, and the dynamics of competition within a system are, I think, fundamentally different from competition between systems. For a start, it's not binary, it's complex. And in that complexity, I think there is more opportunity to exercise agency. Whether you're a big country or medium-sized country like Korea, or a tiny city-state like my own. Right? Now, whether we have the wit to recognize the opportunity to exercise agency and the ability to seize those opportunities, those are different matters. But in principle, there is the opportunity. Put this all together, and what do you have? I think we are all confronted with two fundamental realities. I think there's a better understanding now that we have to deal with both the US and China, and we have to deal with both simultaneously as a necessary condition of dealing with either effectively. If there is no US, there is no balance, we will be dealing with China in an extremely asymmetrical environment that can only be detrimental to us. But frankly, without the US, without China, and that's our own experience in my country, there is the risk of US taking you and your interests for granted rises quite high. So you have to deal with both. But at the same time, I think all of us, particularly in Southeast Asia, are not without concerns about both the Chinese and the Americans and their behavior. I mean, the concerns are not the same, and they are not held with the same intensity, but they exist. So you put these two realities together, that we have to deal with both, but we have concerns about we have both. And I think what you are going to see is a new kind of international system or international order emerging. Early symptoms are already evident. This is an order I call dynamic multipolarity. It's very similar to what has already been mentioned, minilateralism. But I don't like that term minilateralism because it seems to me to have a rather static connotation. Well, what I envisage is a much more fluid system of rather eclectic coalitions forming, dissolving, and reforming around different issues along the central axis of US-China relations. The composition of these things will vary from issue to issue. Some may include both the US and China. Some may include one or the other, and some may include neither. But it's a very fluid system that does not displace existing alliances, existing forums, but forms an overlay over them. And you're going to have, at least in our part of the world, an architecture of multiple overlapping frameworks. It's going to be complicated, it's going to be messy, but this is a messy region. One final point, and actually Richard already made the point, I think it's a mistake to look at multilateralism as a panacea. It is one of the tools in the toolbox of statecraft and diplomacy. It is not always the most appropriate tool. And in any case, multilateralism must rest on a foundation of stability. And stability must in turn rest on a foundation of strong deterrence. And on that note, I will thank you for listening to me so patiently. Thank you.